Hey guys, so at the time you guys are seeing this video, it is July 15th, 2023, which is the 40th anniversary of an important day in gaming history. The release of this, Nintendo's first home console, the Nintendo Famicom, or Family Computer, which a lot of you guys are probably confused as to what this is, but this is the Japanese version of the Nintendo Entertainment System, NES. It clearly looks completely different, and we'll get to why in a little bit. But yeah, I just recently picked this up on eBay. At the time you guys are seeing this video, it would have been over a month after I got it, but it's pretty cool. I always wanted one of these. It was released on July 15th, 1983, along with some games like Donkey Kong and Popeye, which at the time were fairly accurate representations of their arcade counterparts, which the system was originally trying to be the best way to experience arcade games at your home. And this wasn't brought over to the US until as early as October 1985 or 1986 as a wide release. But as for why this happened, you have to remember in 1983 the US was going through a video game crash, which, if you don't know, it was because of the flood of the market with really bad games and systems like the Atari 2600 and ColecoVision and all of those other systems that were out back then, because there were no quality control in the industry. Anyone could make a game and release it into stores, and so you got lots of crap. And they really wanted to bring this over to the US because in Japan this was a success really early on, but they had to do some changes to release it here. First off, they had to change the design completely because, as you can see, this looks more like a toy than a game console. People wouldn't have taken it seriously. That's why over here we got that gray box to make it look more like a VCR or something like that. They actually released it here as a toy, so people don't think that it's a video game console. They released it with Rob the Robot, which they eventually took that out of the bundles like a few years later, but they really wanted to market it as a toy here so parents could buy it for their kids, because in all honesty, during the video game crash, nobody wanted anything to do with home video game consoles anymore. There was arcades, which people were happy with, and that was a successful industry even here in the US at that time. But home video games, due to the bad reputation that the Atari and all those systems at the time were giving it, nobody wanted anything to do with it. So if they would have released this here, they would assume that it wouldn't sell well, or it would have just been like a fad, because that's just how gaming was seen back then in the early 80s and late 70s. But as we know, this really had a lasting legacy because it's one of the most iconic game consoles ever to exist. Had lots of classics like Super Mario Brothers, Zelda, Mega Man, Castlevania. All of those games were on this system, and it had a pretty good long run. So right now we're going to take a look just at this console itself, the Famicom. See here, it's a nice red and white color scheme. But what's interesting is that this has two controllers that are hardwired to the back of the system. But what's bad is they're not detachable, and the controller cords are actually really short. But looking at the controller, it's pretty much what you'd expect. It's similar to an NES controller. This is the first player controller port. It has a 1 on it there. And then here's the second one, which the interesting thing about this one is that it has a microphone up at the top, which it's actually used for certain games. Most notably in Zelda, you can kill certain enemies by screaming into the microphone. The cartridge slot is like most typical video game systems of the time. You put the game in at the top, and this is where a Famicom game looks like. This is Super Mario Brothers. See, the cartridges look pretty small. And then there's the eject button. Back of the console, there's a TV and game switch, and there's a RF port, which this is the only video output that this has, which at the time of release in 1983 it was fine, but as time went on this became an outdated video method, so as a result you're not going to get very good video quality out of this if you get it stock. And here's the power and reset button. Power button, you see it has this little orange sticker under it to note that it's turned on, but there's no power LED, so you wouldn't know if it works or not. Then in the front, this is unique, it has this extension port, which was used for peripherals like the zapper or special controllers. And yeah, this all is in the Nintendo Entertainment System, but as I said, they made lots of changes to make it look more like a serious device, like a VCR or something, which is why the games load at the front instead of the top like most other video game consoles, because they didn't want it to look like a game console. They didn't want people to think, oh, it's just another video game machine, and you know, then it wouldn't sell well. And originally the NES here was released in New York first in October 1985 as a test release, and it did really well here. It was released with Rob the Robot, as I said, and also the Zapper with games Gyromite and Duck Hunt packed in. And then eventually they release games like Super Mario Brothers here too, which yeah, this is the exact same ROM as this. As you can see, the game is a lot bigger. And it's funny because the board inside it doesn't even take up the whole amount of space. But yeah, with Super Mario Brothers, that was one of the first full platforming games that was more than just a single screen arcade style game. Like, you actually go, there's full long levels and with a clear objective of getting to the end. It wasn't just collecting items and such and getting to the top of the screen on a single screen like most arcade games at the time. Alright, so now let's talk about the US version of the NES, which, as I said before, was made completely different so that it doesn't look too much like a children's toy. They wanted it to look like a serious electronic device that one would have in their living room at home, like a VCR or something. Which explains why the cartridge slot is in the front. And of course, as we all know, you just put the game in like this, turn it on, which creates its biggest flaw, because over time the pins would bend, and as you all know, when you turn the system on and the pins don't make a contact, usually you get a blank screen or the power LED just flashes and the system basically resets itself. Well, that part is actually because of the lockout chip they put in here, which was to prevent pirated games and other like weird bootlegs or unauthorized games, because they didn't want a repeat of what happened in the second generation to cause the video game crash. But in more recent years, of course, there's a well-known fix for that. You just take out the fourth pin of the 10 NES chip and you avoid the blinking power LED, but that still leaves the cartridge slot, which you either gotta bend the pins back into place or just get a new set of pins entirely, which I recommend OEM pins, but sometimes the aftermarket ones are alright. But anyway, the other difference, as I showed before, the cartridges are much bigger on the NES, and as a result they have more pins. They have 72 pins compared to 60 of the Famicom, which means that if you want to play Famicom cartridges on a US system, you have to get one of those adapters that you put the Famicom game inside and put it in an NES. But if you do that, they'll work perfectly fine. And another benefit of the NES over the Famicom is that it has AV output, which is better quality than RF. I mean, in today's standards, it's still kind of laughable quality, but that's for the mid 80s. That was pretty much top of the line, because majority of people had RF. Obviously, we all know the original model NES here, despite its flaws, it's one of the most iconic console designs in video game history. Everyone knows what it is, even if you don't really know much about video games, but you see it, you're like, oh, that's Nintendo. That's one of the first big game consoles. But anyway, the funny thing about that is that the Famicom was not exactly the first console that Nintendo released. In 1977 in Japan, they had a system called the Color TV Game 6, which essentially was just a Pong device, which was common in the early 70s. That was what the first game generation was, just a bunch of Pong clones. I don't own one of these, so I can't really show you anything about it. And it was only released in Japan, of course, like I said. But the Famicom and NES was their first big successful console, as we all know it. Eventually, Nintendo wanted to expand on their success and make bigger games, so in 1986 they released this add-on, the Famicom Disk System, which is a floppy disk loader that goes at the bottom of the Famicom. You just put this RAM cartridge at the top of the system like this and put the system on top of the Famicom, although it doesn't really connect to it. The only thing, you gotta plug in another power adapter, but it also runs on batteries too, if you wanted to try that. And the games for this were floppies, like I said. Here's an example of one of the games. This is actually the Japanese version of Super Mario Bros. 2 that wasn't released over here because it was seen as too hard and too similar to the first game by the localization team. So eventually we got this game released as Super Mario Bros. 2, Doki Doki Panic, which was reskinned and turned into Super Mario Bros. 2 here. And for the longest time, not many people knew the truth. People just took it as that's Super Mario Bros. 2 because there was no internet to really know about that. But yeah, this is what the game discs look like. You just slide it into the front, and you get this cool little boot screen. The disk system actually did birth some games that we know today, such as The Legend of Zelda and Metroid and Castlevania. They all had their start on the disk system. But the thing is, it didn't sell particularly well, mostly because you needed to buy that extra hardware to play those games, and as a result, there weren't many games released for it. But it was a cool piece of technology for the time. So eventually, some of the best games for it did get releases over here on cartridge form, but with some changes, because the Famicom Disk System actually had what's known as a FM synthesis chip, which added extra sound capabilities and made the game sound a bit better than what the original Famicom could put out on its own. But as a result, they had to change that when releasing the games over here. And another thing was that since the games were on discs, you could save to the disc, whereas a cartridge, you couldn't do that unless you put a battery inside it. So some of the games, when they got ported over to the NES over here, they either had a password or just didn't have saving at all. But some of them did, though, like Legend of Zelda had a battery in it and was one of the first games that you could save your progress, which was pretty cool. This brings me to another thing about the localization of games here to the US for the NES. They had some really strict quality control, so they don't repeat what happened in the second generation that led to the video game crash. For once, all games had to be licensed by Nintendo. As you can see here, see this Nintendo seal of quality that you see at the bottom of games. Yeah, they had to go through an approval stage, which means that either they didn't release certain games that they figured wouldn't sell well here, or they didn't release games that had some sort of cultural differences, or they would make changes to some of that stuff, like removing religious symbols, or maybe removing some blood, or some sort of extra violence, or making the games easier here or harder, depending on how they went about things. But yeah, they had to go through all of these steps to bring games from Japan over to the US, and subsequently over to places like Europe. As a result, some games did not get released over here. Another thing they did was that developers were only able to make 5 games a year, at first for the system. As a result, some companies made extra subdivisions to be able to release more games. Like Konami, they created a subdivision called Ultra Games, and they released some games for the system to be able to release more than just 5. They also had a strict control on the industry too, because they only allowed companies to make games for Nintendo and not for any other company like Sega or anyone else. And as a result, that also kind of led to the NES's success, especially over here, because there was almost no competition. I also wanted to talk about something else on this video, because July 15th in 1983 wasn't the release of just the Famicom. It was a release of another console from another beloved game company. Sega released their first home console called the SG-1000, which I don't own that, by the way. It's kind of expensive on eBay, but it was only released in Japan, but it was on a more technical level to consoles like the ColecoVision or the Intellivision. So it wasn't as powerful as the Famicom, and therefore it didn't do very well. So a few years later, in 1985, Sega releases a more direct competitor to the Famicom. They released the Sega Mark III. We would get that over here in 1986 as the Sega Master System. Unfortunately, while it was a slightly more powerful console than the Famicom or the NES, it didn't do very well due to how popular the Famicom and NES were. And what didn't help was Nintendo's strict policies that I mentioned about before when it came to third-party game development. So naturally, the Sega Master System didn't have as big of a library as the NES did, nor did it have as many of the iconic games that you would have seen on an NES. It did have some cool games on it, but a lot of the games that are the gems of the Sega Master System were only released in Europe, because Nintendo's policies didn't really happen over there. For one, the NES wasn't released in most of Europe until later in 1987. Sega Master System was already out there by then, so the Master System had the same effect that the NES had over here, where it was the big game system everyone had, while the Nintendo was seen as the more inferior option. Which is funny to think about, because here, if you ask people who were even alive back in the day, they don't even know what a Sega Master System is. And in 1987, a computer company known as NEC releases a console called the PC Engine, which was one of the first 16-bit game consoles, which means it had better graphics and sound compared to what you'd see on a Famicom or NES. And it became a really big success. And in 1988, Sega, despite their previous failures at a home console, they released another console called the Sega Mega Drive, which was a 16-bit console as well. We would ultimately get it as the Sega Genesis, which, funny thing to think about was that the Mega Drive didn't do very well in Japan. It had a pretty weak launch lineup, and as a result, it wasn't something the consumers wanted. Their competition, the NEC PC Engine, did really well compared to Sega's efforts. And Nintendo even was still doing pretty well with the Famicom. But in 1989, when America would eventually get the Sega Genesis, the marketing that Sega did for that system was like unbelievable. They were really trying to get Nintendo out of the picture with boasts about Genesis does what Nintendo, and showcasing their better graphics and sound, more mature games, even having real celebrities on board with it, like Michael Jackson and others. Like they weren't gonna have games on a Nintendo system, that's for sure. Unfortunately, things didn't go very well like they did in Japan for NEC and the rest of the world. They did release their PC engine as the TurboGrafx 16, but that was a big failure. System only lasted a couple years here, and not many people heard of it actually. That's funny, but it still had some cool games on it. But it was all thanks to Sega's marketing, which is why that didn't do very well. And Nintendo was, while they were still successful, they needed to come up with a new system fast, because if not, they would become history. So in 1990, after the threats of both Sega and NEC, Nintendo releases their 16-bit console as a successor to the Famicom, the Super Famicom, which a year later we would get it in the US as the Super Nintendo. And on a technological level, it was more capable than both the TurboGrafx 16 and Sega Genesis, or PC Engine and Sega Mega Drive, with a much better color palette, much better sound capabilities, so on, and more complex games. Sega saw this as a threat and decided to make some add-ons for their Genesis known as the Sega CD and 32X, which, due to their high price points and limited library, they didn't do very well. And naturally, the competition just kept on going. All while the 16-bit console wars were going on, Nintendo was still actually going pretty strong with the NES. They were still releasing games for it until 1994. And some of those games were even comparable to what you'd see on 16-bit consoles. They also released some revisions to their console. Japan got the AV Famicom, which, as the name implies, was a Famicom that now had an AV output, which was far better than RF. It used the same AV output that the Super Nintendo and Nintendo 64 would use. And they also used that design for the NES top loader here in the US, which was far more reliable compared to the original NES, due to now using a traditional top loading cartridge slot. But unfortunately, they went a step in the wrong direction by taking out the AV port and only giving you RF. And the RF quality on there wasn't even that good, with having vertical bars in the background, which you were able to have Nintendo replace the RF board in your system if you called and sent it in. Now I want to talk about my personal experiences with the NES. Now, being that I was born in 1996, I wasn't alive when it was a relevant console, nor did I really grow up with it. But I did know what it was because I would see it in other people's houses, or older family members would tell me their experiences with the NES. But I never actually got to play one on my own until later. I did play some of the games through emulation or the Wii Virtual Console or something, or through remakes for newer systems, but I didn't actually get my own NES until 2012, which I actually did a video about it back when I got it, but I deleted it from YouTube for whatever reason. But here's some footage of it.
Finally, after a long amounts of years waiting, I finally got an NES, Nintendo Entertainment System. Okay, so I got everything plugged in. Turn it on. Yeah, RF. Contra work on. And it works. Controller. Get the controller.
I did actually hold off on getting one, mostly due to the problems I heard with the cartridge slot. Just getting it to work. I didn't want to get an NES and feel that I was wasting money on something that wasn't going to work properly. But eventually, while I did experience that when I bought my NES, it was somewhat easily fixable. And I still had some great fun with it and got some cool games throughout the years. Of course, the Mario trilogy. Like, if you haven't played any of the Mario Brothers games, just do that. Do that right now. There's plenty of ways to play it. Then there's also the Mega Man series on the NES. It's one of my favorite game series of all time. The Contra games, Battletoads, even though it's a really hard game, but it's still kind of fun. Double Dragon, Ninja Gaiden. And then of course there's some bad stuff like Back to the Future. And all the other licensed movie games that were out on the NES. Mostly by LJN, but besides that, it was just home to so many great games. Alright, so that does it for this video. I hope you guys all enjoyed my little retrospective video for the Nintendo Famicom and NES. Happy 40th anniversary to the Famicom. It's hard to believe that it's already 40-year-old technology, but despite its age, it's still very fun to play the games these days. If you don't have the original hardware, I recommend you either buy that, or if you don't want to deal with aging components or anything like that, there's billions of ways to play and experience some of these great games. Like, the Nintendo Switch Online is one of the most common modern ways people do it. You just pay the $20 subscription a year and you get access to a bunch of the classic NES games. Or you can even go the clone console route, like a Retron, and play physical cards that way, so you don't have to hunt down an old system. But either way, whatever you have to do to play some of these great games, do it. As always, more to come. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned. Bye now. You just put this